Hi everyone, it's Annie. I am making this recording for the first time. I think I'll get better at this. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for your communication. Thank you for being here. You guys know that spring break has been extended, and week 9 initially was going to be a short unit on art collecting and museums, but it's going to be even shorter now because we have this kind of mini week. And so I'm going to give you an overview of Unit 4, Art Collecting and Museums, in this screencast, and I'm uploading it onto YouTube. I'll embed that in a file on Canvas, and that's where you're seeing it here. I hope that this is helpful for you. Just so that you know, I am speaking extemporaneously the way I do in class, and the intention here is just to give a very brief overview of the material. All right, what we're seeing here on this first slide is an image on the left. This is a really early picture painting of the inside of a museum. And honestly, museums are not that different than this 19th century painting today. We still see huge open halls with lots of different artworks hung on the wall. And on the right, what we see is a recent criticism of museums by a group of activist artists called the Guerilla Girls. See their name down here. This is not gorilla like the primate, but this is guerrilla like the kind of revolutionary fighter definition of guerrilla. And what they're asking in their poster from the 1980s, it says, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Met? Less than 5% of artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female," pointing out the fact that institutions like art museums also reveal our own societal prejudices, reveals underlying racism and sexism, classism, and so forth. Okay, let's see here. Here are the guiding questions for this mini unit. And I have to say, I'm actually kind of glad we're starting with this mini unit. It's giving me a sense to kind of get my bearings in all of this. It's also giving me, giving all of us an opportunity, I think, to adapt with these bite-sized pieces here and not jump into a big unit. So here are the guiding questions. How did the institution of the art museum develop? How do art museums shape our understanding of art and how we assign value to art? And by assigning value, that I mean monetary value, I mean cultural value. What do we consider important? What are some museum and art collecting practices that have been challenged in recent years? And for example, one practice is favoring the work of male artists, and that's a critique that the Guerilla Girls, amongst others, have waged. And what are some ways that artists have criticized museum practices? And again, using that example from the first slide, the Guerilla Girls. All right, this is just helping us look ahead to the Canvas discussion response that is still due Friday at noon. I am making everything due at noon from here on out, just to keep it as simple as possible. Nothing is really changing much about the Canvas discussion responses. So if you've been approaching those in a certain way for the semester and you feel like you've been understanding them, you've been doing well, then keep it up. What this discussion post is asking you to do is to go look at the floor plan of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and answer the following questions. How is the Met, which has a huge, massive art collection, lots of different periods, lots of different geographic regions are represented, so how are they organizing it? What are the advantages and disadvantages of this organization? And propose an alternative. So how else could they be presenting this material? All right, let's talk about the history of the museum. Um, this our notion of the art museum really developed in Europe, and it started in the Renaissance in the 16th and 17th centuries, where we see the development of what's called a Wunderkamer, a curiosity cabinet. The Wunderkamer is something that aristocrats they would open up a room in their house and show collections of their things. And we're seeing an example of a Wunderkammer here on the left, down below. So, it would be collections of musical instruments, of porcelain, of jewelry, rare books, all of these different things. And we see the transition then from the Wunderkammer to the idea that we could be displaying things publicly in a public institution. And that's where we get something like the British Museum, one of the oldest art collections, one of the oldest public museums. And the British Museum develops during the 18th century, during the time of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a larger intellectual movement in Europe where people start to think about, okay, it's important for us to categorize and save human knowledge. This is when the encyclopedia is developed for the first time, and the British Museum opens for a place for people to go and look at artifacts from different cultures around the world. That this is important to display. It's important for people to have access to. This leads us then in the past 100 years to the development of the modern museum and what's often called the white cube. And we see an example of that over here on the right. The white cube is the idea of a kind of big open room and series of rooms in the museum where works of art are displayed on a white wall, maybe with a little bit of information, maybe not. Each painting that we see here in the photograph has its own space and it's neatly organized, and we go through to appreciate the work. All right, this is all important. Because museums shape our meaning. They and our understanding of the world. They form a historical narrative. This is how we understand human civilization and human history. And when we see works of art in a museum, we automatically assume them to be authentic. We assume them to be masterpieces. And that's why it's so critical for us to question what is being shown in a museum, how is that work being shown in a museum, and maybe what side of the story is being forgotten. As I mentioned before, this is also how we gauge monetary and cultural value. And when a work is shown in a museum, it presents an idea of permanence, or that this is something that should last for all eternity. This is something that we value now and we should value in the future. And so again, it's so critical for us to think about, okay, well, what's not being shared in this story, and consider how museums are shaping these stories. One way for us to begin to question is to think about current museum controversies. And the Parthenon sculptures that have been in the British Museum for over 200 years, this is the topic of one of your readings for this week. And in this reading, you will learn about how the British Museum acquired the Parthenon sculptures. Spoiler alert. They were stolen and taken back to Britain, where they were sold then to the British Museum. And what the controversy is today, because there is a movement now for these priceless, valuable works of art to be shown in Greece, to be shown in their proper context. The other reading for this week, one of the other readings for this week is talking about a current museum controversy that we've already discussed in class. Those are the Benin bronzes. Do you remember those Benin bronze plaques that we looked at a few weeks ago? So they're in museum collections all over the world, including the British Museum. They're not the only villain here. Many museums have taken works of art in past periods. And so the debate is today is, how do we repatriate these works, and how do we more explicitly and openly discuss the history of these works that is connected to the history of European imperialism and colonialism in Africa? Finally, we can also think about how artists have critiqued the museum as an institution. What have artists done to consider taking their work out of the museum? Thinking about alternative spaces to share their artworks and also use art as a vehicle to critique the museum. And here again, I'm showing you two works from the Guerilla Girls. They do poster campaigns, so they're not putting their works into museums. Well, sometimes they do. Sometimes they've become so famous that you can see this photograph in the right is one of their most famous posters that we already talked about being shown in a museum. But here's another one of their posters on the left. These posters are put up in the public space on the side, on billboards, on the sides of buildings, for anybody to come into contact with. The other thing the Guerilla Girls do is they make public appearances to talk about discriminatory museum practices. And here's one of the Guerilla Girls herself. They always make public appearances wearing a gorilla mask. They remain anonymous because for them, it's not about the individual, it is about that collective action. And so anonymity is important in this case. You're going to read about other artists in one of your readings, and other artists who are thinking about critiquing the museum, taking their works of art outside of the museum as well. All right, this is my very first video. Thank you all for making this transition with me. Please let me know if you have any questions. Reach out on email, and I will be in touch very soon.